Diary of a Wimpy Kid, a novel in cartoons by Jeff Kinney. So, you've heard of this book before, right? I'm sure everyone has heard about it. In fact, I feel like I'm the last person to finally get around to reading it. It came out in 2007. I don't remember where I first heard of it. In 2007, I was living in Japan. Since that time, I've lived in Australia, Cambodia, and Vietnam, and was back in the U.S. Intermittently during that time. Um, but I definitely know during my time in Vietnam, this book has been very popular. It's been translated into Vietnamese. So I see the Vietnamese, some of my students carrying around the Vietnamese translation of it. Also, the English version of this book is everywhere. And if you've lived abroad, if you've ever lived abroad, you can probably identify with this. When you go into a bookstore in Vietnam, there's only a few shelves of books in English. And so if there's something that is just always reoccurring there, uh, it's very easy to notice what's prominent because the selection is so limited. Uh, Back in the U.S., I might never have come across this book because the bookstores are much bigger, and this would have been in the kids section. It would have been in a different shelf in a totally different section than the books I would have been looking at. But yeah, here in Vietnam, I run into it a lot more. So I've known this was extremely popular with my students for years, but never got around to reading it. Never really felt much of a desire to read it. I mean, I do read kids' books occasionally, maybe more than occasionally, if you look at my reviews on this channel, but didn't feel like this was targeted towards me. Then, earlier this week, I was at work, and if you've been watching my weekly reading vlogs, I've been talking about a different schedule I've got at work these days. I've got a very early start, and I've got a couple classes in the evening. So I'm doing some long days with a break in the afternoon, in which I usually try and get some reading done. This is usually my book to read at lunch, but I forgot it one day. I was home from work. I was reading this book while I was eating my dinner. And then the next morning, I just forgot to put it back in my bag. So there I was at work, had a long lunch break and nothing to read. So I went to the library. Now, again, if you've been following me on these weekly reading vlogs, you know that I've got like 9 books that I'm supposed to be reading, and I'm not reading. I'm doing a terrible job at keeping up with the books I'm already reading. So I was deliberately looking in the library for like the easiest book to read, like something that I could get through in a couple afternoons. And I saw this, and as luck would have it, I had just gotten done talking about this book with my students in class that morning. We were talking about good English books for them to read, part of their extensive reading program. This book was available on a website, English Language Learning. If I remember, I'll try and link to the online copy of this book. I was showing it to my students, and I was saying, I know this book is really popular in Vietnam because I've seen so many students reading it. And like 2 or 3 students in the class said, yeah, I've read it. And I said, did you read it in English or Vietnamese? And they said, yeah, both. There is actually, sorry, I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent about reading this book as a language learner. But there are tons of idioms in here. First of all, let me get something straight. All I need is catch me carrying this book around. Get the wrong idea, sissy. I mean, so many idioms and phrases there that just make it very difficult for my, any English language learning student to read this book. But because this book has been so popular in Vietnamese translation, and I guess because of the appealing visuals, um, that's why the students keep wanting to try it. By the way, I've been reviewing graphic novels and comics on this channel, and I was debating whether or not to categorize this as a graphic novel or as a novel that just had a lot of pictures. In the end, I think I'm going to count this as a novel or a book with pictures. But you can see it's borderline here, huh? This is almost a comic. So yeah, the distinction as far as my reviewing goes is comic books only get a video review. Proper books, I try and do a brief written review on the blog as well. So there'll be a brief written review accompanying this. You can I'll include a link to that in the video. Okay, anyways, pick this book up after years of seeing it around, and I knew it would be humorous, but I thought it would be something that kids would find funny, but wasn't very funny for adults. But it was really funny. I was reading through this book, and I was just smiling or chuckling to myself the whole time. I was reading it while I was waiting in line at the cafeteria, and just, you ever have it where you're reading a book and you just find yourself smiling there while you're standing in line, or kind of chuckling to yourself? It was much funnier than I thought this would be, given that I was not in the target audience for this book. But I did go on Wikipedia to research it after I finished it. According to Wikipedia, this started off as a webcomic back in 2004. And I think it was a webcomic aimed at an adult audience, or like teenagers or adults, I guess. Kind of people who were reading webcomics in 2004. And then it became so popular that the author and his agent wanted to make it into a book. And according to Wikipedia, it was originally going to be pitched at adults. Wikipedia says they were kind of going for like the Wonder Years type thing, where it was for adults who were looking back at their childhood. But then the publishers convinced them it would be much more commercially successful if they just aimed it at children. Now, Wikipedia doesn't say, and I don't know, how many changes to the content was made after that decision. If they rewrote it, if they rewrote the jokes or anything like that. But I suspect, they were already reworking an existing webcomic. I suspect maybe that it was just the marketing that changed. I don't know. But yeah, there were so many parts in this book that just cracked me up. I found it quite funny. Now the book is episodic in nature, and again, maybe this comes from its origins as a webcomic. So he starts out introducing the fact that he's got a journal. But then the entries will jump around. So, Thursday, and then, it would be like a new day and a new observation he has. And then it'll jump forward sometimes several weeks or months up to Halloween or Christmas or something like that. There are a few callbacks, and without getting too much into spoiler territory, there are a couple things that you thought were throwaway gags that come back at the end. So kind of clever. What's the word for that? I think there's a literary term for that, right? When you kind of have these things that are seemingly throwaway jokes, but then actually ends up to being a big plot point later on. Yeah, but at its funniest is when this book is. It's at its funniest, I think, when it's at its most realistic. And here's a great example. He says, I'm just going to read this little section here because I think this illustrates this perfectly. It says, today we had phys ed. So the first thing I did when I got outside was sneak out to the basketball court to see if the cheese was still there. And sure enough, it was. That piece of cheese has been sitting on the blacktop since last spring. I guess it must have dropped out of someone's sandwich or something. After a couple of days, the cheese started getting all moldy and nasty. Nobody would play basketball on the court where the cheese was, even though that was the only court that had a hoop with a net. Then one day, this kid named Darren Walsh touched the cheese with his finger. And that's what started this thing called the cheese touch. It's basically like cooties. If you get the cheese touch, you're stuck with it until you pass it on to someone else. The only way to protect yourself from the cheese touch is to cross your fingers. But it's not that easy remembering to keep your fingers crossed every moment of the day. I ended up taping mine together so that they'd stay crossed all the time. I got a D in handwriting, but it was totally worth it. This one kid named Abe Hall got the cheese touch in April, and nobody would even come near him for the rest of the year. This summer, Abe moved to California and took the cheese touch with him. I just hope somebody doesn't start the cheese touch up again, because I don't need that kind of stress in my life anymore. So, this is totally the kind of thing that you could easily imagine happening in middle school. Now, in my middle school, we didn't have a cheese touch specifically, but the idea of a moldy old piece of food that nobody at the school is cleaning up and just gets more and more disgusting out in the basketball court, I thought, yep, that's middle school. The idea of things like a cheese touch, where all of a sudden they just decide that, it's basically cooties, and cooties is when kids just decide that you're passing on something intangible to around, and it's kind of elementary school, but it's kind of still lingering around in middle school. The point being that this is all completely realistic. You could totally imagine this happening in your middle school. Now, it's written up with kind of a matter-of-fact tone that makes the ridiculousness of it seem all the more humorous. I guess the contrast between the tone, I hope someone doesn't start the cheese touch up again, because I don't need that kind of stress in my life anymore. And I think the humor in this book, that kind of tone of reporting, gets cumulatively funny. The more you read, the more funny it gets. Just because, I don't know, you just kind of get immersed in that voice, if that makes sense. I don't know. I just found the more I read this book, the more I was prone to laugh at it. There were just tons of really funny stuff in it. Now, it's not all complete gold, because there are a few cases where it gets a little bit too ridiculous. There's a few different examples of this, but the one that stuck out in my mind the most was the haunted house. So they go to a haunted house, and then they get an idea to make their own haunted house. So they have all these plans for things they're going to do in his friend's basement, and they're passing out the flyers, and they're going to charge admission. It says, by the time we finished putting the flyers up around the neighborhood and got back to Rowley's basement, it was already 2:30, and we hadn't even started putting the actual haunted house together yet. And it starts at 3, right? So we had to cut some corners from our original plan. Now, this is the kind of thing I thought, all right, this isn't realistic. I know they're kids, but if it starts at 3, and if they're gonna, they're planning to do all this stuff, they're not gonna be handing out flyers until 2:30. I mean, the whole idea of thinking that they could hijack his friend's house's basement is a little bit, is the kind of thing that would be in like a sitcom, but not in real life. And the fact that they get so behind time that they only have a half hour to set it up, I felt like I could see the strings being moved, if that makes sense. Like, I knew the author was intentionally making the situation as ridiculous as possible to try and get some cheap jokes out of it. But because it didn't feel like anything that would actually happen, it didn't actually feel that funny to me. Now, the good news is, after that part ended, then we go back to stuff that's more satirical of actual life as a middle schooler, and thus more funny. And then we have an episode here with them having to run away from some teenagers, which struck me as a little bit far-fetched. So we alternate between these episodes that are a little bit far-fetched and consequently not that funny because it's not as grounded in the satirizing of real middle school life. Back to the stuff that's really funny. So you take the good along with the bad in a book like this, but you can see from this video, it's just so easy to read that even when you're on one of the more ridiculous stretches, you've only got a couple pages to turn, and then you're back to some of the funnier stuff. And when it's funny, this book is really funny. And there were a number of places where I thought it was really funny. I'm tempted to just read out a whole bunch of parts of this book I thought that were really funny, but that would just be spoiling the book, wouldn't it? Although I don't know why I'm worried about spoilers, because I feel like I'm the last person on earth who has finally gotten around to reading this book. Certainly that's how it feels in Vietnam, like I said before. I don't know, maybe in the U.S. it's not so prominent. I don't know, I've been living abroad for so long, I've kind of lost touch. Let me know. Let me know how prominent this book is back home. So this is, as I'm sure you know, now part of a whole series. And my school library has a bunch of them. I don't think they have all of them. I may well pick up another book in this series, just because I enjoyed this one. But I think I'm going to wait a little while. Because, something like this, if you binge it, you could easily get tired of it quickly. Maybe I'll wait a couple weeks and pick out another one. I don't know. But I really... I got some good laughs out of this one.